Good morning. Welcome to the World Trade Center's Global Business Webinar Series. We are excited today to have with us Bruce McIndoe, President and founder of WorldAware, and Dr. Gary Weber, Senior Director of Food Safety and Contamination Prevention at WorldAware, as we cover another important topic, global food security and safety. This webinar series is designed to keep our members connected and to have access to global topics of interest to the business community. And last week, we hosted a very thought-provoking session on the future of globalization with Bruce. I look forward to a follow-up session and a deeper discussion with Bruce on a concept that he left us all with, the United States of the Americas, and what that impact would look like. Today, we will hear from Bruce and Dr. Weber on global food security and safety. And next week, a week from today, we have a session on big changes driven by the pandemic. To see a list of upcoming webinars, please visit WTCI.org. Before we get started, I would like to welcome you all, our members, our board directors, new companies that are joining us for the first time, and our WTCI team. Without them, this series could not be possible. And for those of you I haven't met, I am Susan Applin, the co-CEO of the World Trade Center Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. Before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to outline the webinar structure. Our speakers will give a 10-minute presentation, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Throughout the presentation, you could submit questions through the Zoom Q&A function. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your video screen. Just click there and type your question. And please include your name and company when submitting the question. Our speakers today are from WorldAware, and WorldAware provides intelligence-driven integrated risk management solutions that enable organizations to operate globally with confidence. They are one of the largest providers in pre-incident and crisis response services for ensuring companies providing contaminated product insurance. In addition to serving as WorldAware's president and founder, Bruce McIndoe also serves on the WTCI board of directors. And prior to founding WorldAware, he worked with NASA, NSA, the CIA, Department of Defense, and developed systems for the intelligence community. He has a bachelor's in physics and a master's in computer science with Johns Hopkins, and he's also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland Global Campus. Bruce is widely recognized as a leader in risk management, technology, and intelligence. And joining Bruce today is Dr. Gary Weber. He's the Senior Director of Food Safety and Contamination Prevention at WorldAware. His career spans nearly 4 decades. He grew up in a farming community in Indiana and received his BS and MS degrees from Purdue University and a doctorate degree from Michigan State University. He was the national program leader for the animal science with the USDA, and then became the executive director of scientific and regulatory affairs for the entire cattle industry in DC. He provided leadership to preventing the introduction or spread of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, and he served as the USDA National Advisor Committee on Meat and Poultry Inspection. He also served as the president of the BioNiche Food Safety US and Prevention Manager for the FDA's Coordinated Outbreak Response and Evaluation Network. Today's webinar is on global food security and safety, and it's a topic that's not only top of mind for global executives, but citizens around the world. Before this COVID-19 pandemic crisis, the United Nations had already reported a staggering level of global food insecurity with more than 821 million people suffering from hunger and most suffering from malnutrition. Through the last year and a half, food security has become an even greater global concern with accelerated impacts from climate change, political instability, increased populations, and rising prices. The world is seeing changing export policies and food and resource hoarding and more pressure to access on food. Now we find ourselves and the rest of the world in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, which is increasing food insecurity around the world and here in the US. And it was just reported last week that 1 in 5 families in the US confirmed that they had reached a level of food insecurity and were unable to fully feed their families. Today, we have 2 very experienced speakers on this topic. And Bruce, I'm going to turn it over to you, but as you and your team assess food security around the world and here in the US, how are you thinking about it with all the pressures that were already in place and now with an impact with a global pandemic?
Yeah, that's a big topic and one we're going to get in. I think at the end of the day, we're seeing that the food supply system is pretty resilient globally. But as we'll talk about today, there are major issues within various regions and countries. So we'll dive into that. Let me move into the presentation here. So I'm going to start out, a lot of what we're doing in this series is ultimately going to end up into a future forecasting session next week. And these are the 5, what we call mega threads that we look at to what drives and defines what our future will look like. We did globalization last week. Today we're going to talk about resource scarcity, but more in the context of the COVID-19 situation and focusing on food. Of course, water and food are 2 existential threats to any human on the planet. If you don't have water in probably 72 hours or shortly thereafter, you don't exist anymore. And if you don't have food, you can go for many weeks, but ultimately will fade away as well. And so they are the 2 most critical resources for human life. So I wanted to talk, we talk about food security and food safety. And so I want to make clear, we're going to focus a lot today on food security. And Dr. Weber will address a little bit about food safety, which is a lot of what we do in helping organizations prevent contamination of the food supply chain. But that's, again, a different topic, but one that we want to touch on because it is important at the high level. So we might want to make sure that people have food to eat. That's fundamentally the food security challenge globally. So when you have food security issues, and this focus of this session is kind of where we are today, especially with the impact of COVID-19, which has been both a supply and a demand impact on the food supply chain, is again, always unprecedented in these current times to see all of that stressed or impacted simultaneously, especially when the human element is impacted. And we've seen that in the meat processing and those kinds of things where there's plenty of livestock to be processed. We have the ability to deliver it, but we don't have the people to actually do the process in the plant. Everything just shuts down, and so it is an important piece. But when we talk about what we're dealing with is when people don't have access to food, whether it's because they're not working and don't have an income and can't buy it, or because of disruptions in supply chain that food prices increase, people get pretty angry. And so you will quickly see civil unrest unfold in countries where people do not have access to food. They're going to put up a fight to survive. And so when we look at that situation, part of our job is to assess, global risk and to, guide companies to understand where in their operating footprint they may be operating in a country or an area where food security starts creating either civil unrest or even political unrest, where rising food prices, you can actually see a nation state fall, regime fall and have regime change over food. So if you look at this map, it's pretty clear that any tan, or especially darker tan color, those are the countries that are most quickly put under stress when the food supply chain is damaged.
Hey, Bruce, sorry, I apologize to cut you off here, but could you share your screen so we can see this map?
Oh, I did share it. I thought, sorry.
Okay, I apologize here.
I'm glad you caught it. And people are like, what is he talking about? Let's try again. Did that come up?
It's coming up. Yes, thank you.
All right, sorry. And let me get there. How's that? Perfection?
Perfect.
All right. Except I still don't have a red thing around my screen, but okay. So anyway, so I was talking about vulnerability, and it's important. This is probably the first slide that's most important for you to be able to see, so you can understand where the risk is globally for countries who rely on imports, right? So they're a net importer of food, and you can see populations when you look at India and China, billions of people that rely on food imports to meet their demand. And then, of course, the continent of Africa and the Middle East that are also highly dependent on food imports. So that's where the stress will occur. But even within our hemisphere, Mexico and some of the South American countries also struggle with food. So food is a huge issue, and why countries that need it are so intensely focused on it, and those that produce it have a lot of control and can impact quickly on food supply and potential panic. We had rice panics and other panics in Asia and elsewhere when food supplies took a tumble and people reacted to it. So where I'm going to kind of draw this is that there's no question that we need more resiliency in the global food supply chain. There's a lot of specialization of product, especially when you think of like cocoa for chocolate and other kind of specialty foods that are out there that have become part of our diet. They're easily disrupted, and when you only have small number of sources. So, and organizations, especially these mega-sized companies now that do most of the food production globally, they're looking for efficiency and cost savings. They're not looking for redundancy and diversity of production, which increases costs. So there is going to have to be some governmental / global intervention to kind of push these companies to make those investments and have the system be more resilient. And this goes for the United States as well. And Dr. Weber will talk about this also in his comments, that we have to be, even within the United States, have more supply diversity and really support localized food production. But even for that, if I'm growing tomatoes and all I can do is take tomatoes and move it to the market, if something's disrupted, I have no way to really store that product. So I end up, plowing it under the ground because I can't, feed it into the supply chain. But if there was an ability for those tomatoes to be canned, then I can store them, or the supply chain can store them for a long time and make them available downstream. And so those kinds of resilient systems don't exist today largely, and need to. So those will be some of the outcomes of this tragic event, hopefully to make us more resilient and make food more available across the United States rather than destroying it. So I'm going to shift over to Dr. Weber to talk now about the U.S. Food security, and we'll get into some of these areas in more depth. So Dr. Weber.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. That was a good intro to the U.S. Food security situation. Bruce and I thought this would be important because certainly here at home, we hear a lot of issues and concerns about the food supply. There is a lot of misinformation. I think it's not intentional in the media. It's just hard to understand what our food system really looks like, and people can naturally become more concerned than they need to be in the absence of our ability to inform them. In that context, there is no shortage of food in the US, although there are some distribution issues and some income-driven disparities. In terms of income-driven disparities, I think a lot of people aren't aware that at least 40 million people in the US, even prior to COVID, were receiving supplemental nutrition assistance from the USDA. That's the SNAP program, formerly known as the Food Stamp program. So there are a lot of people that are at risk of food insecurity in the United States, and it's been a long-term problem that I think we perhaps have not paid enough attention to. There are these four major distribution or production networks in the United States that provide us with a level of resiliency and redundancy, as Bruce mentioned, in a way. These are the retail distribution networks, that is the grocery stores, and that form of food distribution. I'll talk a little bit about how that has been stressed, particularly during this period of time. There's a hotel, restaurant, institutional network, and that is a different type of packaging and product distribution. There's the export markets that we have and systems that are aligned to focus on that market. And then there's the foods sold directly from farms. So let me jump in then to the retail distribution facet of this. Well, first of all, sorry, let's go to this slide. Okay, so we're not going to talk a lot about food safety, as Bruce mentioned, but globally, these are the top issues that, regardless of where you are in the world, the order may shift a little bit about what's of most concern to you and people in your country, but these are the things that we work routinely and extensively globally with food production systems to reduce the risk, in concert, of course, with where the respective regulatory agencies are. So these are there, they're static in a way, they just modulate based on risks within country and within production systems. So now off to the retail food supply topic. So the current situation is that, for consumers, we are now depending heavily on distribution through retail. This is actually a picture of one of my grocery stores on the Eastern Shore of Maryland on March 22nd. And for weeks, every time there was meat in this case, it was gone, and milk was gone, and people were hoarding, and we've all heard about toilet paper and things. This gave the impression of food shortages, when in reality, a lot of people have stored, it must be an enormous amount of food in their freezers. Hopefully they're not wasting it. Food waste in the United States is a huge problem. The average person wastes over 600 pounds, which is nearly 2 billion pounds of waste food annually in the United States, at a time where we have 40 million who are in a food insecure situation. That's another issue that we have to deal with. Store shelves now are pretty well stocked, I would say. Even yeast is available, which has been missing in our local grocery store for about a month. So let's move then to the next slide, Bruce. So this is the area that has probably had the biggest impact from COVID. Of course, we're not eating out, we're not going to bars, we're not attending those kind of activities. Americans consume at least 20%, some people say 30% of their nutrients, their foods, at these HRI establishments. And the companies that are providing food into those networks have found themselves wondering how in the world can they get all the food they still have into the retail grocery store chains. And so USDA and FDA pretty quickly allowed companies to be less, I guess, focused on the complex labeling that's required for normal distribution of food to retail. And I've seen chicken tenders in the store that were meant to go probably to a restaurant chain. And so this is where this capacity, this 20 to 30% of the food that was normally distributed into the restaurant chain, this is actually now almost a surplus of food. It's just having a difficult time moving into channels that we can get to it. And of course, it's impacting companies who have poultry and swine that can't be processed because there's a slowdown in demand from this side and also reduction in employees. But it isn't going to trigger a food supply issue as far as we can tell because we've got this surplus. So let's go to the next slide, Bruce. Now, on the export side, this is that third category. The United States exports an enormous amount of food, as Bruce's slide showed. We're in that net export category. In March alone, we exported more than 291 million metric tons of pork. That's an increase of 38% from the previous year. And so, same thing with beef, up by 7%. So countries around the world perhaps had put in additional orders with concern that this could affect the food supply. This put a big pressure on meat processors. I think perhaps that it may have led to increasing the reduce in the ability maybe to protect employees as best as they could have, and that's being addressed. But this just shows you the capacity of the system to move product out, and I think it's fantastic that our food has gone into countries that otherwise, as Bruce has mentioned, could have a food shortage during this time and create social and civil unrest. Let's move to the next one. So this is an analysis from a prominent analyst with a global lending firm that's talking about the issues of temporary closures of meat plants that we've heard about, that it could shrink retail and food service inventories by Memorial Day, and this could drive up prices. Now, this analyst says it will likely drive up prices. I'm not really the best economist and my crystal ball is foggy, but understanding the scope of the system and its capacities, that may not be likely. It may be more in the possible category. We'll have to wait and see. I know plants are reopening in the United States that have had health issues. Here in Maryland, there's a focus on testing of employees, better social distancing, and protective measures with face masks and things in the poultry sector. Although there have been, I know, at least 2 million birds that did need to be euthanized here on the Eastern Shore because the production systems just couldn't move them through, and there's chicks waiting to get into those facilities, and that's a tragic waste of food and all the time the producers have put into it. But it is an implication. It has financial implications to those companies. So Bruce, let's go to the next slide. And Bruce had mentioned this relative to the issue of having more resiliency associated with farm production. The community supported agriculture focus, the CSAs you may hear about, the locally grown produce and meat and poultry products has been growing for quite some time. I think COVID-19 is going to stimulate this, more interest in locally produced food. In 2015, which is one of the last years that I could find statistics, this was about an $8.7 billion market. It's probably well up over 10 or 11 now. That's still only about 10% of our total food production in terms of dollar value. But the number of farms is increasing. In 2015, it was over 20,000. And this not only provides food seasonally to communities, but it begins to bind people together in urban and rural areas, enhances our ability to work together as a society, and has definite fundamental benefits in the event of a crisis, that people know each other and they have their community they can count on. So there's many, many benefits to this growth of locally produced agriculture and the CSA approach. So this gives you an overview of this diversity that we have that gives us a resiliency platform that helps us through this. I think the question globally is, how can we help other countries assess these areas and create these resiliencies and protect the population from, as Bruce has mentioned, potential civil unrest, a lack of nutrition. We're blessed here that this has been developed over time, but it is at risk because if we keep a pressure toward more mega operations that takes away incentives and opportunities for these smaller farms to produce products, it actually may decrease our ability to deal with an issue like COVID in the future. So this is a time to consider all this and plan for the future as it relates to our food supply.
Well, thank you, Bruce and
Yep.
Dr. Weber, for that.
So we're, you know, obviously the range of impact on food security to insecurity is wall to wall worldwide. You know, Africa is in a food insecurity situation right now with COVID. Many tens of millions of people that don't have sufficient nutrition. And then we're blessed, obviously, with our production. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Susan, and see what kind of questions and things we can move to.
So we do have some questions. Thank you again, and we'll take some questions from attendees. I have one from Ava. Could you address how international land purchasing deals affect global food security?
Agricultural land is a finite resource on the planet. And so in the current model of how we produce food, it is a very valuable product. You know, we're looking at issues in the United States with climate change and those kinds of things where a lot of our agricultural production will actually move north and into Canada. And so Canada is going to become a huge agricultural producer. So any restriction of that land to being able to produce food and or support livestock can ultimately have an impact on food supply. There's no question. I
have another question here from Deb Kilty. Mm-hmm. I understand that in Hong Kong and China, the demand for plant-based meats has increased substantially since the coronavirus outbreak began. Do you see this becoming a global trend?
So you have to remember that, and Dr. Weber can talk about this as well, but you know, meat protein is a new phenomenon in the rising kind of economics of Asia that were largely plant-based and grain diets. And so I don't see any real subtext to that one, it's expensive. Number two, a lot of it's imported. And if people can pivot to a good plant-based substitute, it's natural to their diet. So Dr. do you have any comments?
No, I think that's true. We're seeing, you know, interest in the United States. I did, and not coming from the livestock sector, you know, I don't want to pick on them, but you know, during this time, you could see that when all the meat was gone at retail, there were plant-based products there. They will fill a niche. They do tend to be expensive. The packaging is an issue. If you look at that issue from a perspective of recycling, as contrasted with, you know, a natural, clean labeled product, and clean labels are important to a lot of people in this country. So definitely it's going to gain a foothold. How much of the market it takes, I think, is going to be driven by conventional realities of their people's interest in culturally in meat and how they cook with it. The issues of clean labels, the issues of packaging, the issues of cost will be the determinants of how far adoption goes in terms of these alternate protein products.
Yep.
Thank you. I have a couple of other questions I want to get to. Sure. This one is from Jim Albrecht. How important do you think urban and vertical farming will be in conjunction with CSA programs, and not just in the US, but around the world?
Critical. Look at the entire ecosystem. Water is probably the major determinant for us having to move to different farming structures. So hydroponic and aeroponic farming, vertical farming, is a major solution path for us to produce the food that we need as we add another couple billion more people to the planet here in the next 15 years. So that's a key thing. And Dr. Weber and I were even talking about this, how this virtualization of work is going to afford the opportunity for many more people to move from cities into more rural settings to become part of this movement. And they could actually have their own, you know, farm cooperatives or individual farms with this technology and still provide support for computer science and finance and all those kinds of things and not have to be embedded in a city.
Right. And I mentioned to Bruce that in Washington, D.C., the University of the District of Columbia has kind of a secret garden all over the place, and rooftops and in the city, and providing fresh produce for people that, and the individuals are involved in production. And it's been amazing to see, and I think they're trying to develop it further before it becomes kind of exposed too much for people to review. But it's a great program, and as Bruce said, I mean, we have cities, you know, they're all over the world, and there's rooftops, and there's wastewater that is safe. People, you know, wouldn't want to necessarily be drinking it out of, you know, perhaps aesthetic issues or whatever, but it can be used to grow produce on rooftops all over the place. It's water that gets wasted too often, and it has great value.
I know we've reached our time, but I do want to get in one more question if I can here. This is from Russell Hill from IMET. The coronavirus pandemic has shown short-term vulnerabilities. Please comment on the long-term vulnerabilities and the rolling crisis brought about by extreme weather events and water availability shortages.
That is a big topic. I just mentioned how important water is to all of this. Livestock being one of the major consumers of water, also one of the top producers of greenhouse gas emission on the planet, and a big movement ultimately to the production of protein through manufactured protein rather than growing it on the hoof. And so that's a trend that's going to be happening. As far as the system, you know, we talked a little bit about that we need to bring more production locally. We need to have more resiliency in that production so that they have not only a kind of a continuous pipeline supply chain of what they're doing and very seasonal, but for the ability to have storage capability, whether it's cold storage, canning, hydration, dehydration. So those are the things that need to be done. I think this pandemic has exposed those vulnerabilities in the system and the inability to shift some of those lanes where produce and meat and those kinds of things are directed. And we're going to learn from this, and we're going to do better, and we're going to produce it more efficiently, and we're going to adapt to a constrained environment when it comes to natural resources like land and water.
Well, I want to thank you both one more time for joining us today. And thank you to everyone else for joining the webinar today. Next week, Bruce will be back, and he's going to be discussing another big topic, big changes driven by the pandemic. And I hope all of you will join us next week, same time. Thank you. And up next, we also have Protecting Your Supply Chain During COVID on May 27th, as well as what the future holds, the U.S. and global economic outlook. And please stay in touch with us. If you have any questions about the World Trade Center Institute, or you'd like to learn more about becoming a member or attending one of our events or programs, please reach out to Lydia Yodi, who heads up our business development and membership program. Thank you.